Oh shit.
What?
Looking dapper.
Yeah, I had an interview today, and I've been too lazy to change.
Hmm. YouTube doesn't auto-populate a link. Like I have to refresh the
Yeah.
page. Which I can be on twitch.tv channel and it'll go live. YouTube doesn't do that. Okay. Live with 99 of the Ego first week. Sweet. Banana. Banana.
I could get started. You ready?
Yep.
Hello, and welcome to episode 99 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we finally know where the CDL is going to be streaming the rest of the 2024 season. Finally, after months and months of wondering and a little bit of praying probably on some people's behalves, but we finally know, and we also have the first week of matches in the books, so we know who's winning and who's losing so far earlier this season, and who's been doing very well in their pick'em, which we'll get to later in this show. And we got some other stuff and that we'll talk about before we get into our week 2 predictions for the CDL. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Like you said, match is actually back. So we're back in the regular routine of having, matches to recap and then more matches to predict and preview, all that good stuff. So enough yapping for me. We can hop right in.
The biggest thing was before we even got into the matches, because we were getting into the first week. Last week we had our episode on Tuesday. We had not known publicly what was going to happen regarding the CDL and where it was going to be streaming this season. There are a lot of indications that it was going to be YouTube exclusively, which would revert back to what we had for the first 3 seasons of the CDL before the 4th season, which allowed co-streaming on both Twitch and YouTube, which was the much preferred option in a lot of people's minds, because you had the option of going to either YouTube or Twitch, and there was no exclusivity. And that seemed to help for viewership and a lot of community engagement. Of course, we can't really have nice things in the COD community. That's not allowed here. So for season 5, the 5th year of the CDL, the Call of Duty League announced that it is going to be exclusive to YouTube. They announced that on Thursday morning, a day before the season began on Friday. Obviously, like, we've kind of hinted at this, and we've thought, this is probably going to be the case regardless, but with it being confirmed, and now that you've seen a few days of people giving their hot takes and their opinions on this, now that it's official, what are your kind of like final thoughts on the CDL announcing that YouTube was going to be the home of the CDL rather than Twitch, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, it kind of just seemed like an inevitability at this point, and the fact that it took so long to announce it was kind of ridiculous. But um, I've said before on the podcast that I actually don't mind watching on YouTube. I really like the ability to rewind the matches live, especially in my situation where I like to, mark down the scores and do scores and standings, that sort of thing. makes it really easy if I miss the thing, the literal last second, and I have to go back and see, like in a hard point, if it's 250 to 217 or a random number, it's really easy to go back just a couple seconds and see what the final score was. Whereas on Twitch, I would either have to go into the VOD or I would have to try and clip it and just use like the clip to view the few seconds before. So that was a kind of a little annoying on a personal standpoint, but um it would be ignorant to ignore the viewership uh and the boom that we saw last year, and the success that um other shows from guys like Zuma and Scump have brought to the league and all that stuff. And there's already been some issues this past weekend and during the first week with what can and can't be shown on Twitch and all that stuff. So probably a topic that's not going away anytime soon, even though we know where the matches will be. But at the end of the day, the league had a decision to make. This is what they did. Hopefully, for their sake, it brings in some decent change that lets the league continue to run. But with everything going on in the background of rumors and murmurings of this potentially being the final season and all that stuff, it could just be they cut a deal and they get that money and bounce after that. So who really knows? But all we know for now is we're gonna be watching the CDL. If you're watching it, it's gonna be on YouTube.
Yeah, that would be what I would imagine is the case, is that, maybe, of course, they had to have some kind of deal to become exclusive to YouTube. Like, they're probably not doing it for free, but what the extent of that deal is, we don't really know. And I would imagine that it's just kind of like one last revenue stream, for this season and potentially for the CDL in general. That would be at least my take on it. But like you mentioned, there were issues from the get-go. The day after the season opener, Zuma and Scump both said that they were having, I don't want to say threats necessarily, but there were a lot of discussions about what they could actually be broadcasting on Twitch, as they're both Twitch partners. They did have these co-streams on YouTube and on Twitch, but essentially what the difference was, on YouTube they could show gameplay, on Twitch they could not. So nothing could be shown in terms of matches on Twitch. So I believe Zuma was doing like a full face cam on his Twitch stream, whereas on YouTube, he had his face cam, but he also had the gameplay of the ongoing CDL matches. Now I think just in general, they're saying that they are not allowed, even in VODs, to talk over or kind of break down the footage or any gameplay, which is a very questionable decision by Activision, in my opinion, because I think it would be quite difficult to enforce if it is in a fair use kind of light. Because if they are actually breaking down gameplay and they're giving feedback and actually explaining things to the viewer rather than just like talking with each other and letting gameplay run, I could see at that point how Activision could step in and say, hey, you can't do that. And as a game publisher, they have like a lot of rights in terms of what they can and or what they can't allow and what they can allow, I guess. There have been a lot of times where games can actually they could stop you from streaming games. Game publishers can on Twitch or YouTube. It's more just like they allow you to do it because that's actually in their benefit, and I would imagine that it's actually in their benefit in this case. But Activision hasn't always done things that you would think are logical, at least in my opinion. But it was also reflected in the viewership that from week 1 of the 2023 season and the week 1 viewership of the 2024 season, there was quite a bit of drop off. And that's not even including that Scump was still playing at the time of last year's season opener. So he wouldn't have had the co-stream at that time. That would have just been like Zuma and other people that were involved in the CDL or in the COD community. The peak viewership was nearly 185,000 last year for the first for the top match last year, and then it was about 107,000 for this one. So kind of just like wrapping all of that up, like what are you thinking in terms of Activision's stance about reported stance, I guess, or alleged stance, because they haven't publicly said any of this. This is all through Scump or Ben or Zuma, regarding what Activision is seemingly accepting from these content creators. But what do you think about all of that, where they're blocking people from putting gameplay on Twitch? That seems like a very odd decision. What do you think?
Yeah, for starters, just before we move on too quickly, the viewership comparison between last year and this year was never going to be close. Keeping in mind last year was the return to Twitch. There were a lot of people and longtime Call of Duty esports fans who were excited about the return to Twitch. Um, so that's like kind of a very difficult comparison. There was no world where a YouTube return this year would be close to the return to Twitch last year. But to answer your question on the flank, Zuma, all that situation, the only thing that really makes sense to me is it must be part of like, the legal deal or something for the exclusivity. And it could be something on the YouTube side where like YouTube potentially doesn't want the gameplay being showed on Twitch because like they are paying money to Activision to have, it exclusively on the platform. That would make the most sense to me, and if there's probably no way we ever find out if that's true or not, so it's really speculation. But at the end of the day, like the especially with guys like Zuma and Scump, like the viewership they drive for the league and the position it's in, and all the rumblings and rumors, however you want to phrase it, um, for the league to potentially do something to undoubtedly its two most popular content creators and co-streamers, which drive massive viewership to their product. If for them to make a decision that could potentially hinder that and lower the viewership they bring in, or in a worst case scenario, drive them away to not want to do what they're doing content wise, that would only hurt the league further. It would hurt YouTube in a sense too, because then they're not having as many eyes on the games and potentially, on ads, all that. So, um, yeah, it's a weird situation, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend to be an expert on fair use and all that stuff, but I feel like you said, yeah, if for whatever reason this ever went to court or something like that, I feel like if you're showing, if like you and me were just talking with gameplay in the background, yeah, I can see why somebody might get mad at that. But if you know you got like laser pointers and drastic examples, drawing on the prompters and stuff like they do sometimes in NFL games and stuff, like where you're actually breaking down what's playing, you can pull up the mini map and show, oh, this guy went this way and this guy held down this one, yada yada. Like I would find it very difficult to see how that would be against any rules, but we don't know the wording of any deals or what exactly is going on behind the scenes. So that's what, at the end of the day, we're just gonna have to wait and see how it all plays out. But no matter what, I do hope, especially just due to the success of Scump and Zuma's shows and co-streams and all that, I hope they are able to come to some sort of agreement with the league, YouTube, whoever it may be, to be able to continue to do what they have done in a productive way for all parties involved.
Before we move on to another subject, the last thing I want to say was a big issue that I have with this whole situation, and it's been brought up by Zuma and Scump, I believe. The CDL had so much time to iron out these issues in the offseason. This did not need to happen while the first weekend of the CDL was going on. If Activision had decided that they were going to go with YouTube, or the owners of the CDL franchises, they decided, we're going to take this exclusive YouTube deal and we're going to change the co-streaming rules for everybody, but most especially that will pertain to someone like Zuma or someone like Scump and Methods or the very top streamers that would co-stream a CDL weekend. If they knew ahead of time, they should have told these guys. They should have said, hey, we know that this is probably not going to be in your best interest. We understand that, but let's work together. Let's figure out a happy medium, or lay out very clearly, hey, because of this deal, you can do this, but you cannot do this. And let's just be very honest about what each other, or what we can really get out of this. But they didn't do that. Apparently they waited until the first weekend, and they sprung the announcement on just the community as a whole that it wasn't something that people knew about. It's been pretty much the CDL's kind of MO for the entire season and for multiple years, that there's no planning, there's no thought ahead of what's actually coming down the pipeline. There's so little transparency that it's ridiculous. I understand that they're in a tough position, and that's why I don't call out Daniel Say like some of these other people, because I know, like, at the end of the day, he's just doing his job. Like, he is a little cog in the big machine that is Activision and now Microsoft. I don't think he's like Roger Goodell or anything. Like, he has like all this power he can wield, and he can do this and that. Like, he could just decide one day, like, I'm going to announce that we're going to YouTube. I don't think he can actually do that. Like, I'm sure if he did that, he'd be fired. Like, there would be like little to no hesitation on Activision's part, in my opinion, that like anybody in that position cannot do anything by themselves. They have to go through so many layers of management and executives, and everybody above them has to make that decision, and then they could finally announce it. I just think it's just, it sucks for those people that probably do care a lot about the CDL and COD esports and the COD community as a whole, but they don't really get to do anything like that. They kind of just have to deal with everybody above them making the decisions that affect their reputation or their standing within the community. But it's just ridiculous that the first weekend was happening already, and the streamers were still trying to figure out what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. That's just ridiculous. It shouldn't happen. And hopefully the second weekend and beyond will be better and will run smoother. People will be a little bit happier, a little more comfortable with what's acceptable and not. But just kind of a ridiculous thing to do on the first weekend of your new season. That just would never happen in a lot of different sports. But yeah, let's move on to another topic. So we got through the CDL YouTube stuff, but we actually did have some matches, which was very fun. That COD was finally back after 4 months or whatever, since or more than that actually, because we stopped in June this year, which was real weird. We had that gigantic off season, and finally in December we picked back up with the 5th CDL season, and we had 11 matches this weekend to watch and discuss. So let's get into it. Let's start with Friday's matches. So we'll go in chronological order. If you've never watched or listened to the podcast before, every week that there are matches, we go over each match. We kind of run down some of the bigger points of the matches. If there isn't anything, some of the matches later in the year where they're two of the worst teams and it was a result that we expected, there wasn't a whole lot of interesting talking points, we might fly through those, but I'm sure we'll have quite a bit to talk about with most of these matches, since it's the first time we've seen every single roster, because every single team had made a roster change coming into the season. Some of these teams are completely different. We have different brands for some of these teams as well. So let's hop into it. Friday, December 8th, we had 3 matches, the first of which was Atlanta versus Boston. We talked about how Slasher was on the Atlanta phase last year, got released in favor of Draza, and ended up being on Boston with the Breach this season. And this was a really close match. It ended up being a 3-2 win for FaZe. Your thoughts on, I think people expected FaZe to win, but maybe not in a game 5.
Yeah, that was my big takeaway. Was it was definitely, at least on paper, probably a little closer than some people expected. There is obviously the narrative of the slasher revenge game, so if you factor that in, and we're expecting, Boston to pull off an upset because of that, then maybe, the scores weren't too surprising to you. But a 12-point hard point in map one and a 6-5 in map two search that Atlanta both won, those are super close. And then Boston wins the next two, might be able to start a reverse sweep. You could, in theory, even argue that, um, a couple things go differently those first two maps, and Boston might have had the potential for a 3-0, which would have just been a whole different ball game there. But then, as we know, even though Draza's in with this squad, that core trio for Atlanta of Celian, Simp, and Abizi, they've been real good at search for a while now, and they're able to close out Game 5, win two searches in their first match, and get that first dub on the board.
Yeah, Simp really stood out here. He had 12 in the Game 5 S&D, which incredible. But and Abizi had 12 in the first S&D. Big Cap 13 in the with the L, but still a really good strong game. Simp 33 kills in map 1. He had 33 in map 3 as well. Just like a ridiculous showing from him. Snoopy also had 30 in the control. So really strong performance from both teams. Really, like I think you have to kind of give grace to a lot of these teams early on in the year where they're trying to figure out what's going to work in an actual match, because we've only really had a few months, or not even a few months. We've had like a month of scrims at most, and this is online, so things are a little bit different. And I'm sure the pro matches, they're still trying to figure out things. But, like you mentioned, Boston was very close to winning this series. The most lopsided game of this series was Game 5, but Boston had a real chance to win any of the first four matches, first four maps of that series. So, very strong performance from them to start off the season. Next, we had Seattle versus the Los Angeles Thieves. Two completely new look rosters. Seattle overhauled their roster and their coaching staff. LAT, their championship core, gone to OPTIC and Atlanta Phase and retirement in Octane's case. And they went up against the Surge. I picked the Surge as my dark horse championship team, and that pick, at least in the first match, and we'll talk about the second match, but it looked really, really good because iLLeY tapped into, the Pope was back essentially. He was hoodie up, definitely his best performance in quite some time. He was just dominant. He was 9-3 in the S&D, which is exactly what you want to see from iLLeY. He had just incredible maps. Was that your big takeaway as well? Was iLLeY's return and kind of his, resurgence a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I thought, Abuza had a strong performance in his debut as well. But iLLeY most certainly stood out. And, I think the biggest thing here with Seattle is obviously it's early, but there were a lot of comments, concerns, criticisms about the lineup construction of Seattle. And I brought it up on one of the more recent podcasts. I can't remember if it's the last one, but the big question when the lineup was initially reported on or announced was who was going to be the second sub. And now we are in a meta here in MW3 where that doesn't really matter. And, the ARs are so dominant. You have Arcides, iLLeY, and Abuza all being able to run an AR with Hook being the lone sub. Like, not to say that, Seattle was fortunate that that's how it turned out, but, nobody controls what the meta is
Yeah.
like at the bat. And that's how it worked out, and it definitely is paying dividends for Seattle early. If any, meta changes happen, then we'll have to see if Seattle's able to continue this success. But at least out of the gate, like that's definitely something that can't be ignored, and I think it's obviously um, a positive for Seattle that, we don't even, if the biggest question heading into the season was who's going to be Seattle's second sub, and we never have to get an answer to that question, it only benefits Seattle in the long run. So I was definitely happy to see iLLeY back, uh, you know, playing well, but just as a team, I think Seattle proved a lot of people wrong. It's still very early, so we got to pump the brakes. Not maybe you're on the Seattle is winning champs
Yeah.
bandwagon after that week, but I don't know if everybody's ready to jump on that just quite yet. It's still early, but you can't go do better than winning your first couple matches when you only play a couple. So um, definitely heading in the right direction there in Seattle.
Yeah, the meta discussion is probably the one to have that the ARs are so much more dominant as a whole right now in the competitive meta, and when that changes, then I think that's when it really has to be like you discussed and looked at with the Surge and some of these other teams in particular, because we don't know when the meta will change or how it will change when it does in fact differ. If the subs get buffed or the ARs get nerfed as a whole, then maybe there's a better discussion to have about, okay, like who's gonna take or who's gonna bite the bullet, who's gonna be that second sub, or if we ever got to a 3 sub 1 AR meta, like what does this roster look like at that point? I think that's gonna be very interesting to watch as we progress through this season. Next, we had the final match of Friday. The defending world champions, the New York Subliners, taking on OPTIC Texas. This was by far the most interesting match of the day because I think these are definitively two of the top 4 rosters on paper, at least heading into the season. New York obviously winning the world championship and then replacing I almost said Prestini, but that's another Preston Priesta. They replaced him with Sib, who came from Seattle and who was an all-star 2 years ago, one of the more talented players in the league. And then OPTIC Texas swapped out Ghosty and Hook for Pred and Kenny. So Kenny, a former world champion. Pred, one of the very, very best players of the first 2 seasons of his CDL career with Seattle. And then you had the Seattle boys fighting against each other. And this was a really, really fun series. Went down to Game 5, Round 11. And the New York Subliners ultimately prevailed, winning 6-5 on Terminal S&D to close out the series and get their first win of the season. Your thoughts on this kind of debut for Kenny and Pred and Sib? How do you think these two rosters looked against each other, considering, like I said, 2 of the 4 best teams heading into the season?
All I gotta say off the rip is I can't remember what map it was in. For starters, I don't pay much attention to Twitch chat when I watch, the CDL on
Shocker.
Twitch in the past or YouTube chat. But for whatever reason, when I was watching this, I want to say it was either after second map or during third map, and I almost screenshotted it, but I didn't because I didn't want to put a user on blast or anything unintentionally. But I saw one comment. I'm pretty sure it was during map 3, if not after map 2. And the comment in the YouTube chat was, boy, or Kenny's really got to get these boys on track or something like that. And I'm like, we are 2 maps into the season, or even if it was third map, we are
Fire off them
literally in the
hot
first
takes right
match
now.
of the season. And I was like, we got to pump the brakes here. Like, I in the past have had no issues with speaking negatively about OPTIC when other people might not necessarily agree on certain topics and on where OPTIC ranks and stuff like that, but we definitely got to pump the brakes in that regard. Like, this was a super close match, 2 S&Ds that went round 11. And it's again, although they made a roster change, New York is still the reigning world champion. So 3/4 of them defending champs, and 3/4 of the best team from last year
Yeah.
when it was all said and done. Um, so yeah, I mean, this was really as close as you can ask it, and obviously the hard points could have been 250, 249 too, but it was a really close series, and it is a tough draw for your first match for any new team, let alone OPTIC. But Yeah, that was whenever I saw that comment, I was just mind blown, and I was like, yeah, this is. We've talked about the green wall in the past being, you ain't first, you last, my mentality, but that was just like I was like, whoa, this is crazy. So, um, that example just kind of illustrates my, one online match for all of these teams isn't going to dictate necessarily where they are at the end of the season or anything like that. But obviously for Optic fans, they definitely would have liked to start their season with a win. New York had other ideas. I did, it was interesting for me. It's just because they were on the same team for their first 2 years in the league. Seeing Civ versus Pred for the first time was pretty cool. I mean, I guess it would be the next closest example would be if Simp and Abizi ever broke up. That first matchup between the two of them would be, that would be must-watch TV. It doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon, and obviously they've been together longer than Sib and Pred were a duo, but nonetheless, yeah, this was definitely a very entertaining one and went down to the wire. So, if we got to see a rematch between these two teams on land at Major One, I definitely wouldn't complain.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, this wasn't the blow it up bowl. It wasn't if one of these teams loses, like, all right, just terminate everybody on this roster. And Optic lost in round 11 of both of these searches, so like a very winnable series, all things considered, for Optic. And you don't pull it out, but it's at the end of the day, like it's fine. Like it's one series. It's the first series of the year. There are a ton of online matches this season. Optic was very, very good in the online qualifiers last year, so I would assume that they're probably going to be pretty good in the qualifiers this year because they do have a stronger roster, in my opinion, than they did last season. So there's really no reason to panic, especially if you lose to the defending world champions in your first match of the season. Chill out, everybody. Chill out. But yeah, New York wins 3-2, get their first win of the season. And then we went to Saturday, December 9th. The first match, Carolina versus Miami. So we had a relocated franchise and a rebranded franchise going head to head. The Vamos boys, the Heretics, who, many of them have not been in the CDL, previously in the CWL, but really only Vickle had been part of the CDL. I think Journey was a CDL sub. Metals, I don't know if he ever made his debut with Toronto back in the day, but
He's on the starting roster, I think.
Okay, so yeah, it's been quite a bit for a lot of these guys, or potentially had not made their debut. So there was a lot of intrigue around this, like how would these teams look, because we, like a lot of these teams, like we have no idea how they're going to play. I'd seen some Carolina scrims heading in, but I really hadn't seen any Miami, and I'm sure that this was a really important match for them because, like I was saying, like they haven't been in the CDL for very long, or for a long time. So it was a big match either way, and it ended up being a 3-0 sweep, the first sweep of the season. Carolina gets swept by Miami 3-0. A pretty tight series, especially the first two maps, 250 to 229 Invasion Hardpoint that goes toward Miami, and a 6-4 Skid Row SND that went in favor of Miami as well. So what did you take away from these two rosters and their debuts? Because, obviously the result definitely in favor of Miami, but did you see anything that stood out to you in either way for any team?
Yeah, I mean, my dark horse pick at Carolina definitely isn't looking as good after just the first week as your Seattle pick, but again, it's early. We got time.
Yeah.
In the same on the same note there, although this was a 3-0 for Miami, those first two maps in particular were pretty close. Nonetheless, the first, just parallel or early comparison that I can make with this is that it reminds me of that initial Heretics team back in Black Ops 4 CWL. Um, Again, only one match here, but similar situation in the past where people did not necessarily have high expectations for the Heretics back in the day. they proved some people wrong, had some decent performances, and here some people had questions about this roster. I mean, we technically didn't even really know their official roster until, or their starting roster at least, until the matches kicked off. But nonetheless, they came out and took care of business. They played aggressive, and um, that comparison. They could be on the trajectory to similar to past Heretics teams of proving people wrong early. So we'll just have to keep an eye on them, how they continue to perform. Similarly, it's only one match, so and Carolina for other people wasn't necessarily one of the highest rated teams coming into the year. So we'll have to see how they do against some of the quote unquote contenders, but. Definitely, you can only play the teams put in front of you, and a 3-0 is a 3-0. So, good job for the Vamos boys. I thought Gwyn played well throughout this weekend, and had a strong debut here, but obviously just didn't get the W at the end of this series. So, still looking forward to what this Carolina team is able to produce. And yeah, it was definitely an interesting match.
Yeah, I don't know if it had any effect on the end result, but I think it's worth mentioning that Miami, this was their only match of the weekend, so they got to completely focus all of their efforts on this one opponent, whereas Carolina, they played Vegas as well on Sunday, so they're kind of, you have to kind of split time a little bit and look ahead just to be prepared for that second match as well. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but I thought at least I should mention it. The next match of the weekend, the Las Vegas Legion versus the Minnesota Rocker. Two new look rosters as well for here with Vegas completely overhauling the roster, aside from Standy, who returned after being picked up midseason. But of course, Standy, former Minnesota Rocker player, Attach, former Minnesota Rocker player, and then the Rocker coming with a new lineup as well. And this ended up being a 3-2 win for the Las Vegas Legion. So I put a little faith in the Legion last week, and they repaid the favor. They end up winning this in 5, and they were especially dominant in Search and Destroy. 12-3 in round count, 6-1 on Invasion in the first S&D, and then to close out the series, 6-2 on Skid Row. And this was also the Nero show. He completely dominated from like maps 2 through 4. He went 8-3 in S&D, the first S&D, dropped 35 kills in map 3, 36 kills in map 4, and he had 8-6 score line in the game 5 S&D. What were your biggest takeaways here from the first matches for both Minnesota and Las Vegas?
Yeah, I mean, the S&D stood out to me. 12-3 round count for Vegas is obviously, as somebody who cares about S&D as much as I do, it's something that's going to stick out no matter what. So that was the biggest takeaway for me. And there was some banter there at the end that originally the Rocker had tweeted like first W to start the CDL was the tweet. Vegas quote tweeted that after the match and welcome G2 to the CDL. So that was a fun one, but definitely a close series. I was obviously leaning towards Minnesota in the pick'em, and was a little disappointed in the performance in Search and Destroy. But hey, if that's what gets Vegas across the line here to start, then they took care of business in that regard. So the hard points were close and a 3-2 in the control. So a lot of close matches throughout this weekend across the board. And it's tough. Obviously, teams are just getting started. It's the start of the game, so maybe it takes a while for some of these teams to separate themselves. But yeah, I guess we have an early S&D wins online qualifiers example here. Yeah, I mean, and that's definitely a fair point. I'm not gonna lie though, I was getting a little excited in that map one. Um, Envoy in particular went 29 and 27, the most engagements and the most kills on Toronto in his debut. The tissue was definitely an issue. He had a pretty solid streak at one point, if I remember correctly. So I just really like this team, and kind of like we've said since the reports of Toronto getting Envoy. This was a team that was in the grand finals of COD Champs last year with Hixie. They get a guy like Envoy who is a world champion. Can't even really argue that. I mean, I'm sure some people might want to argue for whatever reason Hixie versus Envoy, but one's a world champion, so you can't really argue against it in my mindset. They have similar play styles, and I just think Envoy is, as Patty P might say, is a pack a punch upgrade there for this roster. So I'm just excited for what this team has the potential to do. And it is difficult to maybe, temper those expectations when they're playing a team like LAG that a lot of people aren't necessarily too high on heading into the season. But again, what did I forget what team I was talking about when I said it, but I know I just said it not too long ago. You can only play the team that's put in front of you. You can't really control that. So
Miami.
Toronto came out and took care of business, and it was exciting to see this roster finally play a match. And I will most definitely be looking forward to some of Toronto's matches against those quote unquote contenders, like New York, Atlanta, OPTIC, etc.
Yeah, definitely. This team, at least in our 4 maps that we've got to see them, they've looked really good, and yeah, like you, I am very excited to see them play against the teams that we've kind of deemed as like above the rest so far this season. Last match of Saturday, Seattle versus Boston. Closing out with Seattle's second match as well as Boston's second match of the weekend. So, we actually got to see quite a bit from each of these teams. But here we saw the Seattle Surge pick up their second win of the season. They win 3-1. They end up only dropping the first hard point in a very, very close invasion hard point. And then they close out with pretty tight wins on Terminal Search, Invasion Control, and then a 60-point win on Terminal Hardpoint. What were some of your big takeaways from this series as we've got to actually see both of these teams twice now?
Yeah, I mean the first thing that comes to mind right away with that first map is, well, I guess for starters there was some um discrepancy or controversy, I guess, around the rules being wrong. Um, in terms of when the map starts in pubs, like the hard point is locked for a little bit, and as opposed to being available to jump right in and start earning points. And apparently that was an issue with this match, and makes the point that maybe Seattle could have won before Boston was able to get a break on that P5 hill. But second point there is that was something we had talked about on this show previously, was Octane tweeting like, surely we're not going to break P5 on Invasion with just gun skill this year. And JCap was in the replies to that. This was during the like, should smokes be allowed debate for a hard point and stuff. And JCap was saying it's, I don't remember exactly what JCap says, and I could look, but I'm too lazy. But he was kind of like saying like, there's going to be some opportunities, yada yada. And we even said like, if it happens, we're going to be able to go back to this and look. And it was literally first weekend here. We had an example of how it was able to be done. Not necessarily easy. There was one, I think it might have been iLLeY versus Snoopy or somebody on like the Tanks Water Street side, and got a really like close gunfight win on a hecklich there that kind of like allowed Boston to push up a little bit, and then they started picking up more kills from there that led to the eventual break. But nonetheless, this was definitely a close first map, regardless of the rule situation. One thing that was definitely hilarious to me was that after the fact, this was later Saturday night. Um, Envoy, who obviously wasn't even a part of that map, uh, said we got told it's on the teams, not the refs, to notice that rules are wrong. Which that's just ridiculous. Like if there was talk too that because the CDL rules don't weren't working on the current patch in MW3 that
Yeah.
admins were setting up the rules manually. Like they need to make sure the rules are right. It can't be on the players to do that. And um, there's been situations in the past where even if a player raised a rule complaint or something like that saying it's wrong, they might have made them play it out anyway. So that's just a whole can of worms there, and it can't happen when we're at this stage. But regardless of that controversy, Boston was able to get that win, and then Seattle, stormed back after that and won the next 3 maps. Still, an impressive performance of Booza this time led Seattle in kills. RCD's had a good series, 79 and 65 for a 1.22 KD series high mark there. So yeah, I mean, it was just, good for you on the Seattle call early there, 2-0 weekend for those guys. And I guess Boston, on the other hand, 0-2, some tough opponents, but they definitely, I was looking ahead too. It doesn't get any easier on their schedule, so we're going to have to see what this Boston team's made of soon.
I want to throw a hypothetical at you. Imagine that you are a prospective CDL owner, or you want to buy a Call of Duty team in, like, say 2019 or so, and then Activision and Bobby Kotick, they come to you and it's like, if you want to buy a Call of Duty team in our exclusive franchise league, you're going to have to pay $25 million to get in this league. It's pretty high price, but we're going to put a lot of support into it. And then like 4 or 5 years later, you have some like underpaid, overworked game admin trying to put together the CDL rules for these matches, but then also blaming the players and the teams for not catching that and not like enforcing a replay. That would be like pretty crazy, right? Like if you agreed to pay 25 million and you have like some guy that's making like 45,000 a year, like pretty much dependent on whether he can actually put together the rules like it's a GB match, that would just be like really crazy, right? But at least we don't live in that world. We don't have to deal with that. But yeah, I think that's ridiculous. It is supposed to be a professional league. I think someone Mock said in the comments, that's like saying NBA refs don't need to know what a foul is. Whoever run this league has brain rot and needs a CAT scan. I probably wouldn't go that far, but I would say like it's ridiculous to blame teams or players for the admins not like getting the rules right. And I understand like they're doing this under probably like quite a bit of stress. Like they're trying to make sure that they don't screw up, but like just in a GB match, like things happen, you get it wrong. But if the league is actually involved in putting together the rules and setting up the lobby, then how in the world would that be acceptable for the players or teams to be, allegedly that's their problem? Like that doesn't make any sense. That should be an automatic replay no matter the result. Even if it wasn't close, or if one of the teams is like, no, we don't need to replay it, then that's fine. But like this was obviously like a problem, and it was so close that the teams probably should have replayed it no matter what. But that it just seems quite ridiculous. But I looked up that tweet that you were talking about with Octane and JCap. Octane said, like, surely we're not going to watch CDL teams attempt to break Palace Hill on Invasion all year using strictly gun skill, right? And JCap said, hate the design of the hill, but there's honestly plenty of breaks on it in scrims. And then he was definitely in the comments after the hill where JCap said, like, oh, I was told that you couldn't break this hill at all, right? So JCap was definitely taking a little bit of a victory lap there. But yep, Seattle starts 2-0 to start the season. Not a great start for the Boston Breach, but there's quite a bit of time to make up and go from here. Seattle and Atlanta, I would imagine, are one of the best teams, and Seattle has looked very, very good early on this year, so maybe they're also one of the better teams. It's kind of hard to even, like, if we were trying to do our tier list right now, it would be all screwed up. Like I would barely want to change anyone just based on a first week of action. We had the final 4 matches on Sunday after that. The first, Vegas versus Carolina. And I want to direct this right to the Las Vegas Legion. How do you lose this series? I was undefeated in Pick'em so far to this game. I was looking real pretty heading into Control Map 3. and you guys get reverse swept by 55-year-old Clayster and a bunch of rookies and Godorex. How dare you? How dare you? In all seriousness, it was annoying, but it was very impressive that Carolina pulled this off. Clayster did a ninja diffuse, so even in his old age, he's very wise and he's very entertaining because the Ego Chall podcast, we heavily endorse assassinations and we heavily endorse ninja diffuses. So either one of those, perfect. And then Gwen had like you mentioned in the first series, they lost, but he looked pretty good individually. He had a round 11 ace to win this series. So very just incredible showing out of him. What were some of your biggest takeaways? Because I don't know if this was the first. This was probably the first reverse sweep of the season, and this was quite a roller coaster because it seemed like Vegas was going to roll to another win, start 2-0 on the season, which would be pretty incredible. But they end up losing this. So, what are your biggest takeaways from Carolina Vegas?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was thinking Carolina here.
Yeah.
Heading into the series, and so I was pretty happy with that end result, but it was definitely an intense one. Can't come much closer down to the wire there than a ninja into a game 5 round 11 ace. So definitely an exciting match there that, especially with the teams and how late the rosters were formed. Maybe some people weren't tuned in or weren't, anticipating that one. But if it's, you missed it for whatever reason, I definitely recommend going back and watching at least the game 5 because that was a good one. But yeah, I mean, all jokes aside and all that, this was a big win for Carolina in terms of responding after getting 3-0'd by Heretics. There was some drama on the flank between Patty P and Clay too, where they were trash talking each other. That was definitely one that I enjoyed. It was all in good fun between two former teammates, and well, I guess maybe some personal jabs were thrown in there, but felt like it wasn't too personal. But it was definitely it was definitely at a time where the flank was debating what's going on with her showing gameplay and stuff. Those two definitely delivered some content that you don't necessarily need gameplay on the monitor for. So, but yeah, jokes aside, definitely a good match. That might have been better expectation wise than some people had hopes for, but um, kind of like you said too, we always endorse ninjas and assassination, so it was a good one to see there. And again, yeah, Gwen definitely stood out for me. Um, Way too early prediction for rookie of the year. Obviously, Abuza with a 2-0 start might have a slight edge over Gwen, but Gwen stat wise might be leading the pack very early in that regard. So definitely way too early there, but for your first two matches in the CDL, he definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, on the opposite end, a rookie that struggled in this series was Purge. He, especially in the respawn, like he was fine in S&D, but in the respawn, 16 and 25 in map 1, 10 or 11 and 23 in map 3, and 7 and 22 in map 4. He wasn't like the only one that was doing poorly, but it definitely was not a good look because overall he went 44 and 82 in the series with a .54 KD. So obviously people are going to take notice of that. But like you just said with Abuza and Win and any rookie that is doing well early on, like it's also very early for the guys that didn't do so well. And I don't even think he did that poorly in the first series that they won. And if they had won one of those final 3 maps, especially that invasion search, then like people would be like, yeah, who cares? Like the stats don't matter if you win, essentially. So, I just wanted to point that out because I know people were definitely, wrongfully clowning him for one bad series, his second series in the CDL, and people are already taking shots. Next match was a really, really close match. The defending world champions, the New York Subliners, and the Los Angeles Guerrillas, who people have been talking about very slanderous the past month or so, saying that they're the worst team in the CDL. And saying a lot of bad things about Vios. But this was a very winnable series for LAG. They end up losing 3-2 in a game 5. They went to 10 rounds in game 5, but LAG ends up dropping the series to New York. But this was very, very winnable. The first map, 250 to 248, that goes in favor of New York. Game 2, High Rise Search, goes to round 11, goes to New York. And then very close games 3 and 4, and then goes to round 10 in game 5. So, like, what can you say about LAG? Because I think we all expect a lot from the Subliners. We expected them to win, but like this was as close as you can pretty much get in each of these maps for LAG.
Literally 1 point off of a 250 249 in the map 1, 15 points away from a 250 249 in map 4, and 1 S&D round. So in total 15 hard points and 1 S&D round away from being like the maximum score wise you could have in a series, with 2 250 249s, 2 6.5s, and a 3-2 in the control. So this might be the closest we ever get to. I mean, I would have to go back and look at all the matches to see if that's ever happened. Off the top of my head, I don't think it has. But definitely a incredibly close match, and we've been saying it throughout this show that there have been a lot of close matches. This arguably might have been the closest, especially when you look at the scores. And you could even make the argument again, especially with the way that map 1 ended, that LAG might have been able to take this series if they were just able to close that one out. Or even map 2, it could have been a 3-0. So definitely a super close series. Going back to your original point about LAG and playing the defending world champions here, like they kind of showed what they're capable of. And again, it's very early in the season. A lot of stuff can change from now and when we're months down the road here. But at the start of the game, these close matches are the ones that could, if you're 10, 20 points away from making champs, like these are the ones that could come up to bite you in the butt in the end. So it was definitely a performance from LAG that not a lot of people were expecting, especially after how they played against Toronto. And they almost made some major noise for a very unexpected upset in the first weekend. So credit to them. No, we'll see if they're able to build on that and have it translate into an actual win. But in terms of a loss, that's almost as close as it can get, like we're saying. So if I was in that camp, I'd have my head held high after that one. It's tough because a loss is a loss, but a very close one and against a very tough opponent on paper that most people probably didn't even think it would go more than 3 maps in some cases. So might be, well, we'll have to see how both these teams where they go from here. But still early days, and no red flags being thrown up or anything like that for either squad. We'll just have to see what happens next.
Well, there was at least one red flag that popped up, and it was Skies in map 1 unequivocally snaking. Whether it was intentional or not is kind of up for debate, and he claims that he was kind of trying to crawl out, but it was definitely like LAG definitely got snaked in that, because Skies is laying down in the hill on Karachi, and he sees Assault, he gets shot by him, and he just starts snaking right then. He ends up staying alive, gets the kill on Assault, and that pretty much changed the game. Like, there's a very good chance that had LAG been able to get that kill, that they would have gotten control of the hill. They only needed 2 seconds to win the map. They were up to 48 to about 210, and New York ended up winning that map 250 to 248. So definitely something there. What are your thoughts on that? Where we've talked about the snaking stuff quite a bit over the last few weeks, and this was kind of the first big example, the first clear example of a player doing it and actually having an effect on the game. New York ended up winning this map. They win 3-2. Like, granted, there's no guarantee that LAG, if New York had lost map 1, that LAG would have won 3 maps or another 2 maps in the series. Things might have been different slightly. But what do you think about this, that LAG is kind of giving him a pass, saying like, that didn't have anything to do with the map, or saying that it's all right to him, or should there be a punishment for the subliners? Because people have been saying that any team or any players that get caught snaking should be blacklisted from scrims. So what's your take on that?
We've talked now over the snaking situation for a while, and it's going to be super tough to police. The only thing, I mean, there's no way any like official punishment could be handed down, because
Yeah.
then the league would be recognizing GAs as part of the rule set, and that's just never going to happen. Um, the only thing I can think of, you hear stories and stuff, at least baseball wise, in the past of like a kangaroo court where, a guy will go 0 for 4 with 4 strikeouts, and he'll be quote unquote fined by the team in house and stuff like that. And that would be the only thing. Like, you could do something like that among the CDL pros where it's like, oh, you snaked here and we got proof of it being egregious, yada yada. You throw $50 in a pot at the end of the year, the pot goes to whoever wins champs or something like that. I mean, that's not a great example, but that would be like the only thing I can think of that would even potentially be able to be done. I mean, if I didn't even see it happen. If it happened, it happened, and if LAG is okay with it, then it is what it is at this point. But I mean, maybe once we get to this, I guess we don't technically know what patch is being played on. We're just assuming it's not the season 1 MW3 patch,
Mm-hmm.
where a snaking nerf is implemented. Maybe it becomes easier to police and regulate in terms of what is snaking and what isn't. End of the day, until snaking just isn't possible in the game, there's inevitably going to be situations like this that pop up.
Yeah, for sure. I also we talked about it, but the snaking is probably one of the more unenforceable GAs because it
Yeah.
happens at a moment's notice and it's not something that you could actually prepare around. You have to kind of expect and hope that someone doesn't do it to you in a crucial moment. And whether Sky's meant to or not, like, it happened, and it's probably going to happen quite a bit, not only from New York but a bunch of teams, I'm imagining. But I think the point was, I think it might have been Zuma that said this. He is definitely like not a neutral party in all of this, but he was kind of saying like, imagine if Celium had been the one to get first caught snaking this season, like the uproar would have been incredible. If it was like Atlanta versus LAT or Atlanta versus Boston and Celium snakes and they end up winning that map, like that would have been, really, really crazy, the reaction. So, Skies kind of gets away with it for the moment, and we'll see what happens down the road if he ends up doing it again or if anybody else does. But I would imagine somebody will, and we'll have another discussion about it at some point. Next match was LAT versus Atlanta. This was a world championship rivalry for a few seasons, but LAT, this is a new era for the Thieves, and Draza now was once part of that LAT championship team and now is a part of Atlanta FaZe. He actually didn't have a very good series, all things considered, but FaZe did. They won some pretty close games, but they end up sweeping LAT 3-0. Like I said, not like blowouts by any means. If you just look at the match result and you see the 3-0, you're like, oh yeah, FaZe really did that. They were very dominant, but that didn't seem to be the case. Was that your takeaway as well from this series?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the maps again, it's definitely one that came down to the wire. 20 points in the hard point, 1 round away from a 6-5 and a 3-5 or a 3-2 in the control. So, really close individual map wise, but probably end of the day a match you expect FaZe to win. And it was Draza going up against his old squad, and it might have not been a huge storyline because it's not like he was really playing against any former teammates there, but um, nonetheless, you think 3-0 for Atlanta FaZe. It's probably what some people might have been expecting in that Boston series. That didn't happen, so all their maps really this weekend were pretty close. But in this situation, they get the 3-0 win instead of a 3-2.
I don't know if you're going to keep track of it this season, but Simp dropped 42 in the control, which is the highest that I saw this weekend. I mean, like, FaZe in general, like, they were just slaying that entire third map. Simp went 42 and 27. BZ was 34 and 30. He's going to get those engagements up. And Cell was 34 and 20. The AR definitely is going to get the fewer engagements, but the higher KD. So pretty incredible stuff especially for Simp to drop 42 in the closeout win. And last match of the weekend to close out week 1, Minnesota versus OPTIC. Fans that have been around for a few seasons in the CDL definitely know that this could be an important match for OPTIC just because of the history, especially with accuracy back on Minnesota. We were not quite sure if there was going to be a breakdown. We did see a round 11 clutch for Minnesota, which is, that's just the accuracy effect. Like, even if he's not doing it, he's definitely going to be on this team. He's definitely, I don't know. Like, I would love to see the actual stats of like his teams, how often they clutch, how often they win S&D, and how often they clutch like round 11s. But they end up winning the search 6-5 on Karachi, but they were not particularly close in the hard points, and they lost 3-2 on Karachi control as well. So OPTIC gets their first win of the season. Your takeaway from OPTIC's first victory and Minnesota dropping to 0-2 on the season?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that jumps out to me is that Minnesota wins the search in this series when Minnesota lost both series kind of lopsidedly to Vegas in their other match. At the same time, OPTIC went 0-3 in Search and Destroy this weekend in Search and Destroy, which isn't necessarily different from previous stereotypes to past OPTIC teams that have been, somewhat respawn oriented or stronger in the respawn modes. But even though they were 0-3 in Search and Destroy this week, all 3 of those losses were 6-5.
Yeah.
So take those numbers and do with them what you will. But I think OPTIC will be just fine. Again, we'll see more of them with time. But if you're 0-3 in a mode and all 3 of those losses are just by 1 round, then something else goes differently in each of those modes. You're technically 1 round away from being 3-0 versus 0-3. So
yeah.
Well, we'll keep. I'll definitely keep an eye on OPTIC in Search and all their modes really. But that was the one thing that stood out to me. Definitely, strong performance in the hard points here. Both of 250-148 on Invasion, the 251 on 93, and hard point in Skid Row. And then I'm scrolling down to the New York match. So they went 3-1 in hard point. So, so some close maps again across the board in this series, but a little, outside of the 6-5 and the 3-2, not necessarily the closest hard point. But we'll have to see how Minnesota responds. Still some questions around that team with the roster. But yeah, I guess, especially that one OPTIC fan during the New York squad who said Kenny need to get the boys in shape. That they might not be as upset with this result that OPTIC got a win here.
Yeah, the search thing with OPTIC is always interesting because we talked about in the past before that they're a really slay heavy respawn team, and then search was at times hit or miss. And I think that's always interesting to look out for. I think when we were talking about which team or about Pred going to OPTIC, and I think even Kenny going to OPTIC, my biggest thing was the first bloods and how aggressive a lot of these players were. Like Shotzi would get blooded quite a bit, and I think Pred was a player that had like one of the highest first blood rates in all of the CDL. So I didn't know how they would mesh. Right now, according to Breaking Point this season, Shotzi has gotten the first blood 3 times and been blooded 3 times. Pred is also 500, 4-4. Kenny, he's gotten 3, he's been blooded 5, and Dashy, the slower AR player, you kind of expect him to get fewer first bloods either way. So he has the fewest first bloods so far with 2, and he's been blooded 3. So it's just kind of interesting to keep up with. Right now they're at a disadvantage, like they're getting blooded more than they're actually getting the first kill of the S&D rounds, which is something to keep an eye out for. Of course, it's a very, very small sample size. It's only 3 maps over 2 matches. And like you mentioned, they've lost those 3 maps by a combined 3 rounds. So like it's going to work out eventually, you would hope. And you're going to get some luck on your side and some variance a little bit there, that they'll eventually, at least OPTIC fans hope, will be able to turn it around and win some of those round 11s. So that does it for the recaps for these matches. The pick'em so far, there were 11 matches this weekend. You went 7-4. I was only disappointed by the Las Vegas Legion, so I went 10-1, which was great. You went 4-0 on Sunday. I went 4-0, or I went 3-0 on Friday, and then we each. I also got 4-0 on Saturday too. So I was really in my bag this weekend. I don't think this is going to work out for me super well for the rest of the year, because you went back and you actually looked at the pick'em records for the last 2 years. So last year you beat me by 3 matches, 136-94 versus my 133-97. Champs was a big one because we were only separated by a single match heading into the tournament. And then in 2022, it really wasn't that close. It was 7 matches, which is like, an entire week essentially that you got ahead of me, 116-80 versus my 109-87. So definitely something that I'm going to have to pick up. The late season, I kind of slow down a little bit, but I got to keep chugging along. And maybe if I just keep picking Seattle and kind of coin flipping on Vegas, maybe it'll work out for me. Let's get into the qualifier matches for week 2. Another, I believe, 11 matches coming at. I actually think it's 10 this week, because there's 4 on Saturday, there's 3 on Friday, and 3 on Sunday. So let's get into these 10 matches and give our predictions. First, on Friday, December 15th, will be Miami versus Vegas. So 2 teams that both got wins in week 1, but Vegas did show a little bit of vulnerability in their loss. I'm gonna go with the Vegas Legion. I mean, we have like very little to see on Miami. We have even less than most teams. They only played 3 maps. But I'm gonna go with Vegas. Maybe search is kind of their way to victory, and you've said it probably hundreds of times. S&D wins championships, so maybe that'll be the case here.
I'm just surprised you're going with Vegas after the rant you went on about them ruining your perfect week. I will not be going with Vegas here. I'm hopping on the Vamos bandwagon, and I'm taking Miami.
Well, Vegas has a second match, and I don't think I can pick them on that one, so we'll just stick with that. LAT versus Boston next up. This is going to be a kind of a bounce back match for either one of these teams. Man, that's a really tough pick. I'm going to go with LAT, but I have very little confidence either way. Like, I think they're pretty evenly matched, and it's pretty hard to predict for either team. Do you think?
Yep, I completely agree. I'm going to go with LAT too, but definitely one I could see going either way, and probably could be a 5-map banger.
The next match is one that I'm really looking forward to. OPTIC versus Seattle. This, you would imagine, is an actual revenge game for iLLeY, because he was benched by them. He had his season pretty much ruined the year before when he got the injury, and he sat on the bench, obviously due to injury for quite a bit. But that's a really tough. Like, I think both these teams are pretty good. I'm going to pick OPTIC, but I am not like sold either way on this either.
I'm going with the storylines. I'm taking Seattle. I think the timeline will be super entertaining if Seattle's able to pull this one off, and I'm going with that narrative.
It also is a revenge game of sorts, I guess, for Preds. So this is first.
No.
It might be. I mean, they didn't allow him to go to OPTIC last year. Maybe he's still pissed off about that. We don't know.
I guess, but there's nobody really involved there anymore. I don't even think, because Revan's not the GM.
It's just the logo. He's just going to be screaming at the trident. He's going to be really upset. Saturday, December 16th, we have 4 matches. So Miami is kicking off the matches on that day as well. I'm assuming that they're doing this because they have, like, obviously they're mostly Spanish players. The earlier you do it in the day,
Yeah.
the European audience might actually catch up for it. So Miami versus Minnesota. I'm gonna go with Miami, but this is a pretty evenly matched, matchup as well. It's kind of can go either way. Yeah, I think that's a lot of these matches, especially early on.
Yeah.
But we have very little to go off of for either of these.
Yeah, I'm going with Miami too, Vamos.
Next match, Vegas versus New York. This is not one that I think is a coin flip, so I'll go with the
sure?
I'm gonna go with the Subliners.
Ah,
If Vegas pulls off the upset, then so be it. But I'm gonna go with the Subliners.
I'm just gonna say we did see what LAG did against New York in that last match, so I guess it might not be completely out of the realms of possibility, but I will also be taking New York.
A really good matchup on Saturday, Atlanta versus Seattle. Depending on what actually happens in that Optic Surge match, this could be even more interesting because if Seattle were to beat Optic, and Optic has, at least for the last few seasons, been a thorn in Atlanta's side, they have not been able to consistently beat them. I think a lot of people will be jumping on the Surge bandwagon at that point. I'm going to go with FaZe, just, a tried and true pick. They have way more experience as, like, at least the trio do, than Seattle does as a team. So I'm going to go with the Atlanta FaZe.
Yeah, it's well documented. My picking, tendencies when it comes to FaZe, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to break tradition here, so I'm going with FaZe. Definitely, though, Seattle, especially coming off a 2-0 week, having to play Optic in Atlanta, it's about as tough of a test as you can ask for to kind of, really get a better gauge of where this team is at. So I am excited for both of these matches, and we should have some more good stuff to talk about for Seattle next week or when we're back.
The final match of Saturday is, I'm not sure why exactly they put this on last. Usually they put one of the matches of the day on last, and I don't think this is one. Maybe they're just banking on Clayster versus Scrappy, that this rivalry is going to carry it. But Toronto versus Carolina to end the day on Saturday, I'm going to go with Toronto. We saw quite a bit with Carolina. They did come back against Vegas, but the Ultra are kind of a different beast. They just went to Champs Grand Finals last season, and Envoy is probably an upgrade. So I'm gonna go with the Ultra.
Yeah, I'm going Toronto here, but I'm glad you brought it up because even if you didn't, I was going to. We've seen the banter between Scrappy and Clay all off season and preseason, so the timeline could be juicy after this one, no matter what happens, and I'm here for it. Either way, I think if Carolina pulls off an upset, a post-game interview with Clay will be electric, and just vice versa. Toronto wins, they get a post-match interview with Scrap. It could be shots fired. So
Just
do
an interview with both of them at the same time, regardless of the result. Just let it happen. Sunday, December 17th, the final 3 matches of week 2, starting with Carolina versus Optic. Gonna go with Optic there, but if Carolina ends up beating the Ultra to end on Saturday, who knows what happens there.
Yeah, tough draw for Carolina to have to
Yeah.
go up against Toronto and Optic in the same, technically back to back, but I'm gonna have to go with Optic as well.
And something we didn't talk about in the, like, with the new format and how there are even more online qualifier matches. I would imagine, like, you can't play the same team twice in these in like one qualifier set. I would imagine that's the case. But that would allow you to play even more teams in a cycle rather than we had 5 matches previously. Now we have 7.
There's just inevitably going to be some crossover because it's 7.
Yeah.
So like that's 14 matches for Major 1 and Major 2. So, with 12 teams are going to have to play repeat opponents.
I just meant like in one week or one maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, in a set it shouldn't matter
Yeah,
because it's only 7.
Yeah, I was just saying that there would be a little more variety in some of these teams. Like, you have less focus essentially on some of these other teams where, more matches, less focus per team. So I just wanted to mention that because Carolina is going to get screwed by playing some pretty tough opponents in week 2. But, granted, they probably didn't have like the toughest opponents in week 1, so they didn't take as great an advantage as they probably should have.
I
Do
mean,
you have anything?
I just think it's, let's just say in a world where Carolina didn't get that reverse sweep, they're 0-2 heading into this.
Yeah.
Then they play these two matches against Toronto and Optic. They lose them. They're 0-4. When there's only 5 qualifier matches, 0-4 is almost like guaranteed to, not get into winner's bracket or have even a remote chance. Now with 7 qualifying matches, 0-4, you win the next 3. 3-4 has a much better chance than 1-4 of getting in. So I think we might see some more drastic comebacks potentially with the increase in the qualifiers, but we'll have to see when we get there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Next match is the Battle of Los Angeles, LAG versus LAT. Gonna go with the Thieves, but I mean the Gorillas really were impressive against New York, so I think this is a lot closer than many people would have imagined starting the season.
I don't know what the exact record is, but I remember there's been a lot of times where this Battle of LA went LAG's favor. So I'm going with the Thieves, but again, based on that performance we saw to end last week for LAG against New York, this could be one that goes the other way.
Final match of the weekend, Boston versus Toronto. Gonna go with the Ultra. Boston is like, who knows what happens earlier in the week. Boston plays LAT, Toronto plays Carolina. Those things could have an effect on what happens in the final match of the weekend, but I'm pretty solidly going with the Ultra here.
Yeah, taking Ultra too.
All right, sweet. So we are now through our predictions. I don't think we have anything left to talk about, but I do want to thank you guys all for watching and listening to the podcast over the, obviously the entire off season, but the first week is finally here, or finally done with. We're into the season. This should be kind of a usual schedule for us for matches, depending on the holidays, which is kind of the little wrench thrown into our plans. But we should be here most weeks to recap the matches and then give our predictions for the next week of matches as well. But thank you guys for listening and watching. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're on Google Podcast. Make sure to subscribe and like the videos on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Pres Byers. And the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show should be next week, next Tuesday, or should be hitting your feeds, Wednesday morning. That seems to be kind of our schedule. I have been planning to do a few like solo, like short videos, like obviously not going to be talking for an hour, but maybe do something on the CDL and put it up on the Ego Chall Podcast YouTube channel. So if you want to see any extra content there, I should be doing something in the next week that will be like a, 5-10 minute video, just me ranting essentially. Maybe that'll be a little bit entertaining for you guys. If not, then you don't need to watch, I guess. But we'll probably be back next week to talk about these matches, and then we'll probably take a break for the holidays, when Christmas is coming around. But we'll get to that when we get to that. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for the support. For those who've been here for the long haul, you might be noticing this is episode 99, so next week should be the big 100. So thank you guys for the support on this journey. Any additional support you guys have is greatly appreciated, and here's to 100 plus more episodes, and looking forward to just the start of the season and looking forward to building on that, and we'll see you right back here next week with more CDL action. So until then.